The security camera captured everything. Margaret Whitmore, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, scaling the 6-foot privacy fence like a woman possessed, her designer heels scraping against the wooden slats. She'd been plotting this moment for months, convinced her new neighbors were hiding code violations behind that barrier. But as her feet hit the ground and she straightened her blazer with smug satisfaction, she had no idea that Zeus, the 140-pound Rottweiler rescue, with trust issues, was already moving through the shadows toward her. What happened next would shatter her iron grip on Maple Grove Estates forever, captured in crystal-clear 4K for the whole world to see. The morning Margaret Whitmore decided to trespass on the Chen property. The sun painted Maple Grove Estates in deceptively peaceful golden hues. But peace was the last thing on Margaret's mind as she stood in her kitchen, pressing her face against the window that overlooked the 6-foot privacy fence her new neighbors had installed 3 months ago. "Absolutely not," she muttered, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping against the granite countertop. "No one builds a fence that high without hiding something." For 37 years, Margaret had ruled Maple Grove Estates with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of homeowners, association authority. Every blade of grass, every mailbox, every flower bed fell under her jurisdiction. She'd made grown men weep over paint color violations and driven 3 families to sell their homes rather than face her relentless campaign of citations and fines. The Chen family had been different from the start. When they'd moved in during the spring, they'd been polite but distant. The husband, David, was some kind of tech executive who worked from home. The wife, Sarah, was a veterinarian who left early and returned late. They kept to themselves, paid their dues on time, and followed every HOA rule to the letter. That should have satisfied Margaret. It didn't. "There's something off about them," she'd confided to her lieutenant, Gladys Morrison, during their weekly HOA board meeting. "Too quiet, too perfect. Nobody's that clean unless they're hiding dirt." The fence had been the final straw. 6 feet of solid cedar privacy fencing, professionally installed, properly permitted through the city. Every regulation met, every form filed correctly. Margaret had spent weeks combing through the documentation, searching for any violation, any excuse to force them to tear it down. She'd found nothing. Now, staring at that fence in the morning. Light! Margaret felt the familiar burn of righteous indignation in her chest. Behind that barrier, the Chens could be running a business, housing illegal immigrants, operating a drug lab, anything. The possibilities fed her paranoia until it metastasized into action. Margaret had been planning this reconnaissance mission for 2 weeks. She knew David's schedule. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he left at 8:30 a.m. for what appeared to be client meetings. Sarah was already at work. The house would be empty, except for the dog. Margaret had caught glimpses of it through the brief moments. When the Chens opened their back gate, something large and dark, probably some gentle giant, she reasoned. Most professionals kept docile pets, golden retrievers, labs, something friendly for their children to play with. She'd noticed children's toys in the yard, too. A swing set, a sandbox. The Chens had kids, which meant the dog was definitely family-friendly. 8:35 a.m. Margaret watched David's Tesla disappear down Maple Street. She gave it 5 minutes, then made her move. Her plan was simple. Scale the fence. Document whatever violations she could find, take photos, and file a comprehensive complaint with the city. By the time the Chens returned home, they'd be facing thousands of dollars in fines and a mandatory hearing that would result in the removal of that offensive privacy barrier. Margaret had worn her old gardening clothes, dark jeans, a gray sweater, sneakers with good grip. She'd even brought a small stepladder from her garage, positioning it against the fence line where her neighbor across the street wouldn't see from his kitchen window. The climb was more difficult than she'd anticipated. At 62, Margaret maintained her figure through yoga and Pilates, but upper body strength had never been her forte. Her hands scraped against the rough cedar as she hauled herself up, her feet scrambling for purchase on the vertical slats. Halfway up, she paused to catch her breath and noticed the small black dome mounted on the Chen's house. A security camera pointed directly at their backyard. Margaret smiled grimly. Perfect. If they tried to claim she'd damaged anything or stolen something, the camera would prove her innocence. She was conducting a legitimate HOA inspection of potential violations. With renewed determination, Margaret completed her ascent. At the top of the fence, she took a moment to survey her prize. The Chen backyard was beautiful. Lush green grass, perfectly maintained. Professional landscaping with native plants that actually complemented the neighborhood. Aesthetic better than most yards she'd approved. The children's play area was clean and well organized. A small vegetable garden in the far corner was clearly marked and wouldn't be visible from the street even without the fence. Margaret's confidence faltered slightly. This wasn't the junky violation fest she'd expected, but she'd come too far to turn back now. She swung her leg over the top of the fence and began her descent into the Chen property. Her foot slipped on the final drop, sending her stumbling forward onto the grass with less dignity than she'd planned. Margaret straightened her sweater and looked around more carefully. There had to be something. A shed, without permits. Unapproved. Additions. Something to justify her presence here. That's when she heard the low rumble. It started deep and quiet, like distant thunder. But thunder didn't come from directly behind you, and thunder didn't make the hair on the back of your neck stand up with primal recognition of predator-prey dynamics your suburban brain had forgotten. Margaret turned slowly. Zeus emerged from the shadow of the house like a nightmare made flesh. 140 pounds of muscle, bone, and barely contained violence wrapped in a coat of black and tan that seemed to absorb light. His massive head was lowered, yellow eyes locked on hers with the focused intensity of an apex predator that had just discovered an intruder in his territory. The growl that emanated from his throat wasn't the warning bark of a family pet. This was the sound that had echoed through ancient forests when humans were still learning to make fire. This was evolutionary memory made manifest. Margaret's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but some deeper part of her, brain, the part that had kept her ancestors alive on the savannah, warned her that running would trigger a chase response that would end very badly for her. "Good dog," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good boy, nice doggy." Zeus took a step forward, then another. His lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that belonged in a natural history museum display about prehistoric predators. Margaret tried to remember everything she'd ever heard about dog attacks. Don't make eye contact, don't run, stay calm, make yourself seem non-threatening. She slowly raised her hands, palms out, in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, louder now. I was just... Zeus cocked his head slightly, studying her. For a moment, Margaret thought she might have gotten through to him. Perhaps he was just protecting his territory and would settle down once he realized she wasn't a threat. Then Zeus noticed the security camera. Margaret watched in horror as the dog's gaze shifted to the little black dome, then back to her. Something changed in his expression. If she didn't know better, she would have sworn the animal was calculating. Zeus sat down. Margaret blinked. The sudden change in posture was so unexpected that for a moment she thought she'd imagined the whole confrontation. Maybe he really was just a big, friendly. Zeus threw back his massive head and began to bark. It wasn't the sharp yip-yip of a small dog or the steady woof-woof of a medium breed. This was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, a primal alarm that could be heard 3 blocks away. Deep, resonant, and absolutely relentless. But there was something else in the sound. Something that made Margaret's blood run cold. Zeus was performing. Every bark was perfectly timed, each pause calculated, for maximum effect. He never took his eyes off the security camera, positioning himself so that Margaret remained clearly in frame. He was creating a record, a performance designed to tell a very specific story to anyone who might review the footage later. The story of a gentle family dog, sitting peacefully in his own backyard, alerting his owners to the presence of an intruder. Margaret tried to back toward the fence, but Zeus immediately stood and moved to block her path. Not aggressively, he never advanced on her directly. But every time she tried to move toward an exit, he simply repositioned himself, always keeping the camera's view unobstructed, always maintaining his position as the wronged party, defending his territory. The barking continued. Neighbors would be looking out their windows now. Someone would call the police. Sarah or David might come home early to check on their distressed pet. Margaret's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. How would she explain her presence in the Chen's backyard? What possible legitimate reason could she give for climbing a 6-foot fence into private property? Zeus seemed to sense her growing panic. His barks became more insistent, more. The first police cruiser pulled up to the Chen house just as Margaret was contemplating the impossible physics of climbing back over the fence, while a 140-pound Rottweiler watched her every move like a chess master contemplating his next victory. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his patrol car and immediately spotted Margaret through the gaps in the fence slats. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio, but he paused when he recognized her. "Mrs. Whitmore?" His voice carried the confused tone of a man trying to reconcile the woman who'd lectured him about his patrol car's idle time during HOA meetings with the figure currently trapped in someone else's backyard. "Ma'am, what are you doing back there?" Zeus lifted his massive head from his paws, studying the new arrival with interest. Then, in a display that Margaret was beginning to recognize as calculated theater, he rose gracefully and padded over to the fence line, tail wagging. The transformation was stunning. Gone was the apex predator who'd held her hostage for the last 20 minutes. In its place stood the picture of canine friendliness, ears forward, tongue lolling slightly, the very image of a beloved family pet greeting a visitor. "Oh, would you look at that beautiful boy?" Officer Rodriguez said, extending his fingers through the fence gap. Zeus sniffed delicately, then allowed the officer to scratch behind his ears. "What's his name?" I don't know," Margaret stammered, realizing how this was going to look when Rodriguez wrote his report. "You don't know your own dog's name?" Rodriguez's tone shifted from confused to suspicious. His eyes swept the backyard, taking in the pristine landscaping, the expensive play equipment, the clear signs of a family home. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to explain what you're doing on this property." Margaret's mind raced through possible explanations, each one more pathetic than the last. There was a possible violation. As HOA president, I have the authority to trespass on private property? Rodriguez cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come around to the front gate, slowly." But there was no front gate. The fence enclosed the entire backyard, and the only entrance was through the house or over the barrier she'd already scaled. Margaret would have to climb back over the fence while Rodriguez watched, completing her humiliation in front of the growing crowd of neighbors who'd emerged from their homes to watch the spectacle. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down had positioned herself conspicuously on her front porch, phone in hand, recording everything. Bob Fletcher from across the street stood in his driveway, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who'd finally lived to see his least favorite neighbor get her comeuppance. Zeus seemed to understand that his performance had reached its next movement. As Margaret approached the fence, he positioned himself directly beneath her intended climbing spot and sat down, creating the most photogenic obstacle possible. Anyone reviewing footage later would see a gentle dog simply resting in his own yard while an intruder attempted to escape over his family's fence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Rodriguez called, his patience clearly wearing thin, "I need you to exit that property immediately." Margaret grabbed the fence and began her ascent, acutely aware that her undignified scrambling was being recorded from multiple angles. Halfway up, her foot slipped, and she had to hang from the top rail for several mortifying seconds before finding purchase again. Zeus watched the entire performance with what Margaret could only describe as professional interest. She dropped to the ground on Rodriguez's side of the fence with considerably less grace than she'd entered with. Her clothes were dirty, her hair disheveled, and she could feel scratches on her arms from the rough cedar. "Are you injured?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested the question was more procedural than concerned. "No, I'm fine," Margaret said, trying to salvage some dignity by brushing dirt from her sweater. "Good. Now I need to see some identification and get an explanation for why you were trespassing on the Chen family's property." The word trespassing hit Margaret like a physical blow. In all her years of HOA enforcement, she'd always been the one wielding authority, the one making others uncomfortable, the one with the power to issue citations and demand explanations. The role reversal was disorienting. "I wasn't trespassing," she said, her voice rising. "I was conducting a legitimate HOA inspection. There have been complaints about possible violations." "From whom?" Rodriguez had his notebook out now, pen poised. "Who filed these complaints?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed silently. She couldn't very well admit that the only complaints had come from her own paranoid surveillance of the property. That's confidential HOA business," she finally managed. Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Ma'am, unless you have a warrant or written permission from the property owners, entering their backyard constitutes criminal trespass. The HOA doesn't grant you the authority to violate private property rights." A second police cruiser arrived, and Margaret watched in horror as Officer Kim stepped out. Kim had been the responding officer 2 years ago when Margaret had called in a suspicious gathering that turned out to be a child's birthday party in Washington Park. The look Kim gave her suggested he remembered the incident clearly. "What do we have here, Rodriguez?" Kim asked, though his eyes remained fixed on Margaret with barely concealed amusement. "Trespassing complaint. Mrs. Whitmore was found in the Chen family's backyard without permission." Kim nodded slowly. "The Chens. Nice family. Dr. Chen treated my partner's cat last month. Saved the little guy's life." He looked at Margaret with new distaste. "They pressed charges yet?" "They're not home. I've left messages." Margaret felt a chill of genuine fear. In all her scenarios, she'd imagined explaining herself to the Chens, perhaps facing a stern conversation or even an HOA hearing. The possibility of actual criminal charges had never occurred to her. "Officers," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm the president of the Maple Grove Estates HOA. I've been serving this community for over 30 years. Surely we can resolve this without following the law?" Kim interrupted. "Mrs. Whitmore, your position in the HOA doesn't give you special privileges. If anything, it means you should know better." A familiar Tesla appeared at the end of the street, slowing as David Chen spotted the police cars in front of his house. Margaret's stomach dropped as she watched him park and walk toward them, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding as he took in the scene. David Chen was younger than Margaret had expected, probably mid-30s, with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to success. He wore khakis and a polo shirt, looking like he'd interrupted a business meeting to deal with whatever crisis had summoned police to his home. "Officers," he said, extending his hand to Rodriguez. "I'm David Chen. I got a call that there was some kind of disturbance at my house. Mr. Chen, we found Mrs. Whitmore in your backyard without permission. She claims she was conducting an HOA inspection." David's eyes found Margaret, and she saw something she'd never encountered in all her years of neighborhood enforcement: complete lack of intimidation. David Chen wasn't afraid of her, wasn't worried about HOA citations or community standing. He was looking at her like she was simply a problem to be solved. "An inspection," David repeated slowly. "Of what, exactly?" possible violations, Margaret said weakly. There were complaints. From whom? David's voice carried the precise tone of someone accustomed to cutting through corporate nonsense to reach facts. Margaret's silence stretched uncomfortably. I see, David said. Officer Rodriguez, I'd like to file charges for criminal trespass. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Mr. Chin, surely we can discuss this like neighbors. Neighbors don't climb fences to spy on each other, David said calmly. Neighbors don't violate privacy and property rights because they're curious about what's behind a legal fence. Zeus appeared at the front window of the house, having somehow moved from the backyard to the living room while everyone was distracted. He sat perfectly framed in the window, looking for all the world like a concerned family pet watching strangers. On his lawn. Margaret stared at the dog, understanding finally dawning. Zeus hadn't just caught her trespassing. He'd orchestrated her downfall with the patience and precision of a creature far more intelligent than she'd given him credit for. Every bark, every movement, every moment of apparent cooperation with the police had been calculated to maximize her humiliation and legal exposure. There's one more thing, David said, pulling out his phone. Our security system recorded the entire incident. I'd be happy to provide that footage to support the trespass charges. Rodriguez nodded. That would be helpful, sir. As David scrolled through his phone, pulling up the security footage, Margaret realized that her 37-year reign over Maple Grove Estates was about to end not in a blaze of glory, but in a viral video of a 62-year-old woman being outsmarted by a dog. The footage began playing on David's phone screen, and even from several feet away, Margaret could see herself scaling the fence like some deranged suburban ninja. The audio was crystal clear. Every word of her inspection justification, every moment of her confrontation with Zeus, every second of her growing panic as she realized she'd been outmaneuvered by a Rottweiler with a better understanding of. The Maple Grove Estates Community Center hadn't seen this many people since the Great Christmas Decoration controversy of 2019. Every folding chair was occupied, with dozens more residents standing along the walls, their phones out and recording, as Margaret Whitmore faced what amounted to a tribunal of her former subjects. It had been 72 hours since her arrest, and the security footage of Zeus's masterful performance had exploded across social media with the viral velocity of a perfectly timed meme. The Karen Meets Zeus was trending on 3 platforms, and Margaret's humiliation had been viewed over 2 million times. But the real reckoning was happening here, in the beige-walled community center where Margaret had ruled for 37 years, through fear, citations, and the grinding bureaucracy of homeowners association politics. This emergency meeting of the Maple Grove Estates HOA is now in session, announced Gladys Morrison, Margaret's former lieutenant, who had somehow managed to become acting president in the space of 3 days. The speed of her ascension suggested planning that Margaret was only now beginning to comprehend. Margaret sat alone at a table facing the crowd, her lawyer beside her. James Crawford was a decent enough attorney for municipal law, but he looked overwhelmed by the circus atmosphere of angry homeowners baying for blood. Before we begin, Gladys continued, I want to remind everyone that this meeting is being live-streamed on the HOA website for transparency. Transparency. The word hit Margaret like a slap. For decades, she'd conducted HOA business behind closed doors, wielding power through private communications and selective enforcement. Now her downfall was playing out in real time for the entertainment of strangers on the internet. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, having driven straight from her veterinary clinic, still wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon cats. David was beside her, his laptop open, presumably monitoring the online reaction to the evening's proceedings. They'd been receiving supportive messages from around the world, donations to animal rescues in Zeus's honor, and interview requests. From 3 morning shows, Zeus himself had become an international celebrity. The security footage had been analyzed by animal behavior experts who praised his intelligence and restraint. A children's book deal was reportedly in the works. Someone had started a GoFundMe to buy him premium treats that had already raised. $15,000. Margaret, meanwhile, was facing criminal trespass charges, a civil lawsuit, and now the very real possibility of being stripped of her position and banned from HOA activities entirely. "Mrs. Whitmore," Gladys said, her voice carrying the theatrical gravity of someone finally getting their moment in the spotlight, "you stand accused of bringing disrepute to our community, exceeding your authority as HOA president, and engaging in criminal behavior that has made Maple Grove Estates a laughingstock on social media." Margaret rose slowly, feeling every one of her 62 years. The crowd's murmur fell silent, and she could feel hundreds of phones focused on her like weapons. "I have served this community faithfully for over 3 decades, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything I've done has been in service of maintaining property values and community standards. If my methods have occasionally been assertive, it's because someone has to make the hard decisions." A voice called, out from the back. "Like terrorizing the Hendersons until they moved?" Another voice. "Or fining Mrs. Park $3,000 because her roses were the wrong shade of pink?" The crowd was warming up now, 37 years of suppressed resentment flowing out like water through a burst dam. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but she could feel control slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Order," Gladys called, though her tone suggested she was enjoying the chaos. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you deny that you illegally entered the Chen property without permission or legal authority?" "I was conducting an HOA inspection based on legitimate complaints." "From whom?" David Chen's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. He stood up, his laptop showing what appeared to be a detailed legal document. "Mrs. Whitmore, my wife and I have obtained all HOA communications regarding our property through a Freedom of Information Act request. There were no complaints filed against us by any resident of this community." The crowd turned to look at Margaret, and in their faces she saw the dawning realization that her inspection had been nothing more than personal vendetta disguised as official business. "The only complaints in our file," Sarah Chen added, standing, beside her husband, "are 17 separate violations notices that you personally filed against us. Mailbox height, measured 3 times and found to be exactly regulation standard. Lawn maintenance, professionally serviced and meeting all community requirements. Garden plants, all approved species according to the HOA handbook you wrote." Margaret felt the room turning against her like a tide. "I was protecting property values by harassing a family that followed every rule you ever made." David's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd been pushed beyond patience. "By violating our privacy, by traumatizing a rescue animal who'd already suffered enough abuse in his life?" At the mention of Zeus, the crowd's murmur turned uglier. Margaret realized with growing horror that the dog had become a symbol, not just of her downfall, but of everyone she'd ever intimidated or bullied in the name of community standards. "Mrs. Whitmore," called out Bob Fletcher, the neighbor who'd watched her humiliation from his driveway. "My daughter wants to know why you hate dogs so much. She's 7 years old, and she's been having nightmares about the mean lady who scared Zeus." The comment hit harder than any legal charge. Margaret wasn't just facing adult adversaries anymore. She'd become the villain in children's stories, the cautionary tale parents would use to teach their kids about bullies and consequences. "I don't hate dogs," Margaret said weakly. "I was simply—" "You were trespassing," interrupted Patricia Williams, a single mother whom Margaret had once fined for having a bicycle in her driveway. "You climbed a fence. You invaded a family's privacy. You terrorized their pet. And when you got caught, you lied to the police about having authority you never possessed." Gladys consulted her notes with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Whitmore, the board has received a petition signed by 67% of community residents calling for your immediate removal as HOA president. Additionally, we've received legal notification that the Chen family intends to pursue both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit against you personally, not the HOA. Margaret's lawyer leaned over to whisper in her ear, his face pale. Margaret, they're talking about charging you with stalking and harassment as well as trespass. The footage shows a pattern of surveillance that goes back weeks. We need to consider a plea agreement. But Margaret wasn't listening to legal strategy anymore. She was watching the faces in the crowd, seeing decades of fear and resentment crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. These weren't her subjects anymore. They were citizens who'd finally found their voice. Furthermore, Gladys continued, clearly enjoying her moment of power, the board has voted to dissolve several of the more restrictive regulations that have been enacted during Mrs. Whitmore's tenure. Effective immediately, residents will have more flexibility in landscaping choices, fence heights, and exterior decorating. The crowd cheered, and Margaret felt something die inside her chest. The community she'd shaped through sheer force of will was being dismantled in real time, her life's work swept away like dust. Sarah Chen stood up, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with life-and-death situations. I want everyone here to understand something about what happened in our backyard. Zeus is a rescue animal who suffered abuse at the hands of people who were supposed to protect him. When Mrs. Whitmore invaded our property, she didn't just trespass, she threatened the sense of safety that it's taken months for Zeus to develop. The room fell silent, the gravity of Sarah's words settling over the crowd like a blanket. But Zeus didn't attack, she continued. Despite his size, despite his strength, despite his history of abuse, he chose restraint. He chose intelligence over violence. He protected his family without causing harm to his perceived threat. That dog showed more wisdom and character than some humans in positions of authority. The implied comparison was unmistakable, and Margaret felt the sting of it like a physical blow. David opened his laptop and turned it toward the crowd. The security footage has been viewed over 4 million times now. Animal behaviorists from 3 universities have contacted us to study Zeus's response. Do you know what they're calling it? He paused for effect, his eyes finding Margaret's across the room. Perfect justice. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret understood that she wasn't just losing her position. She was witnessing the birth of a legend that would outlive her, outshine her, and ultimately erase everything she thought she'd built. As the meeting devolved into celebration and planning for a new era of community governance, Margaret gathered her papers with shaking hands. Her lawyer was already discussing plea agreements and damage control, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Outside the community center, Margaret paused in the parking lot and looked back at the building where she'd held court for nearly 4 decades. Through the windows. 2 weeks after the community center tribunal, Margaret Whitmore discovered that her problems extended far beyond criminal charges and social media humiliation. The real nightmare began when Channel 7's investigative reporter, Amanda Torres, knocked on her door with a camera crew and 3 boxes of documents. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Amanda Torres from Channel 7 News. We're doing a follow-up story on the Zeus incident. But during our research, we've uncovered some concerning patterns in your HOA enforcement over the past decade. Would you care to comment? Margaret's blood turned to ice as she recognized some of the papers visible through the clear storage boxes. Financial records, bank statements, email printouts, the kind of documentation that suggested someone had been digging very deep into her affairs. I don't have anything to say to the media, Margaret said, trying to close the door. Amanda's foot blocked it. Mrs. Whitmore, we've discovered what appears to be a systematic pattern of selective enforcement, where families who refused to use your husband's landscaping company faced escalating violations and fines. We've also found discrepancies in how HOA funds were allocated, particularly regarding the community improvement projects that coincidentally benefited your property values the most. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Rick's landscaping. Business had been struggling for years, and yes, She'd occasionally suggested to residents facing citations that professional landscaping services might help them achieve compliance. It was helpful advice, not corruption. "We have no comment," Margaret said, but her voice cracked on the words. "We also have testimony from former HOA board member Janet Richards, who alleges that you manipulated vote counts during several key elections and threatened board members who opposed your initiatives." Behind Amanda, Margaret could see neighbors emerging from their houses, phones out, ready to record her latest humiliation for the ever-hungry social media machine. The Chen house was visible in the background, its privacy fence now decorated, with a small plaque that someone had installed reading Zeus's yard in bronze lettering. "This is harassment," Margaret managed. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've documented over 40 families who've left Maple Grove Estates during your tenure, many citing harassment and excessive fines. The property turnover rate in your community is 3 times higher than comparable neighborhoods. Would you like to respond to allegations that you've been running a systematic campaign to drive out residents who challenged your authority?" Margaret slammed the door, but she could hear Amanda continuing to speak to the camera outside. The story would air tonight, and tomorrow the viral video that had destroyed her credibility would be joined by investigative journalism that might destroy her freedom. Her phone was already ringing. Rick, calling from his office where he was presumably watching his landscaping business evaporate in real time as the corruption allegations spread online. "Margaret, what the hell is happening? I've had 3 clients cancel today and my business insurance wants to schedule a meeting. Did you really tell people they had to use my company or face violations?" "I gave professional recommendations," Margaret said weakly. "That's not illegal." "It is if you're taking kickbacks. Margaret, did you take money from me for those referrals?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Margaret had never taken direct payments, but Rick had paid for their vacations, their car payments, their home improvements. She'd rationalized it as marital finances, but now she could see how it would look to investigators. "We need lawyers," she said. "Good ones. We can't afford good lawyers, not if they freeze our accounts. Margaret, the HOA is threatening to claw back salary and benefits payments. They're claiming you weren't legally authorized to set your own compensation level." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair, the same spot where she'd planned her reconnaissance mission into the Chen backyard 2 weeks ago. That morning, she'd been the undisputed queen of Maple Grove Estates. Now she was a criminal defendant facing multiple investigations and a husband whose business was collapsing under the weight of her scandal. The doorbell rang again. Through the peephole, Margaret could see a young man in a suit, carrying official-looking documents. "Mrs. Margaret Whitmore? I'm serving you with a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of former residents of Maple Grove Estates. You're being sued for conspiracy, racketeering, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Margaret took the papers with numb fingers. The plaintiff list was 3 pages long, families she'd driven away with citations and fines, residents who'd sold their homes rather than deal with her enforcement campaigns, people whose lives she'd disrupted in service of her vision of community perfection. The lead plaintiff was Maria Santos, a single mother who'd moved away 2 years ago after Margaret had fined her $2,000 for having children's toys visible in her front yard. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw the news? Zeus says hello. A friend." The message was accompanied by a photo of Zeus lying in his sunny backyard, wearing what appeared to be a custom-made bandana reading, "Justice Dog." He looked supremely content, like a creature who understood that the universe had finally aligned in his favor. Margaret's laptop chimed with an email notification. Her inbox was flooded with messages from reporters, lawyers, angry former neighbors, and internet trolls who'd tracked down her contact information. But one email stood out. It was from David Chen. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wanted you to know that Sarah and I have been following the news coverage of your situation. While we certainly don't condone your actions regarding our property, we're not vindictive people. However, we've been contacted by over 30 families who have stories similar to ours, patterns of harassment, selective enforcement, and what appears to be systematic abuse of HOA authority. We've decided to establish a legal defense fund for residents who want to pursue civil action against you and the HOA board. Zeus has received $23,000 in donations from people around the world who were inspired by his restraint and intelligence. We're donating all of it to help your former victims pursue justice. We thought you should know. David and Sarah Chen, and Zeus. Margaret stared at the email until the words blurred. Zeus, the rescue dog she'd tried to intimidate, was now funding the legal campaign that would probably destroy what remained of her life. The poetic justice was so perfect, it felt scripted. Her phone rang again. This time it was her sister calling. From Phoenix. Margaret, I just saw you on the national news. They're calling you the most hated person in America. What have you done? Before Margaret could answer, call waiting beeped with another incoming call, then another. Her phone was lighting up with notifications, interview requests, and what appeared to be death threats from strangers who'd decided she represented everything wrong with suburban power structures. She turned off the phone and walked to her front window. The street was filling with news vans, curious neighbors, and what appeared to be protesters carrying signs reading, "Justice for Zeus," and "HOA Karen must go." Someone had spray-painted "Trespasser" on her driveway in red letters. Margaret closed the blinds and sank onto her couch, finally understanding the full scope of what Zeus had unleashed. It wasn't just her criminal case or her civil liability. It wasn't just her reputation or her marriage or her financial security. Zeus had exposed her as the symbol of something larger and more toxic than simple neighborhood disputes. She'd become the face of petty authoritarianism, of suburban bullying, of the kind of small-scale tyranny that made ordinary people's lives miserable in service of abstract principles and property values. The rescue dog who'd learned that patience was more powerful than aggression had engineered not just her downfall, but her transformation into a cautionary tale that would outlive them both. Outside, she could hear Amanda Torres interviewing neighbors for the follow-up story. Margaret caught fragments through the window. "She made my daughter cry over chalk art on the sidewalk. $3,000 in fines for a garden gnome? We were afraid to let our kids play outside." Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of her legacy. Every family she'd harassed, every citation she'd issued, every moment of fear she'd instilled in her neighbors was being documented and broadcast to a world that had decided she represented everything they hated about petty authority and suburban tyranny. As the sun set over Maple Grove Estates, Margaret realized that Zeus wasn't done with her yet. The patient, intelligent dog who'd orchestrated her initial downfall had somehow managed to expose the entire system of control and intimidation she'd built over nearly 4 decades. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new lawsuits, new humiliations. But tonight, Margaret understood that the real punishment wasn't legal or financial. It was knowing that somewhere behind that bronze-plaqued fence, Zeus was sleeping peacefully in the sunshine, having achieved something most humans never manage. In a lifetime, perfect justice, administered with the patience of a creature who understood that the best revenge was simply letting your enemies reveal their true nature to the world. The revolution was accelerating, and Zeus had become its unlikely general, commanding an army. He'd never met in service of a justice he'd never sought but somehow perfectly embodied. Margaret pulled a blanket over her head and tried to sleep, knowing that when she woke. 6 months later, Margaret Whitmore stood in the parking lot of the Maple Grove Estates Community Center for what would be the last time. The building looked different now, freshly painted in colors the residents had chosen through democratic vote, with a new sign reading Maple Grove Community Center, serving all residents since 1987. The criminal case had ended with a plea agreement, 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent restraining order keeping her 500 feet from the Chen property. The civil lawsuits were still grinding through the courts, but her lawyer had advised bankruptcy as the only way to protect what little remained of her assets. Rick had left 3 months ago, taking half of their remaining savings and filing for divorce. His landscaping business had collapsed under the weight of the corruption investigation, and he'd moved to Florida to start over with his brother's construction company. His final words to her had been simple. "You destroyed everything. Good we ever built." But Margaret wasn't here for nostalgia or reconciliation. She was here because of the letter. It had arrived that morning, hand-delivered by David Chen himself. Simple white paper, neat handwriting, signed by someone she'd never expected to hear from again. Mrs. Whitmore, the community service coordinator, told us you've been working at the animal shelter where Zeus came from. We thought you might like to know that your supervisor, Janet Miller, has been sending us updates on your progress. She says you've shown genuine dedication to helping rescue animals, particularly the ones with behavioral issues and trust problems. She says you seem to understand something about second chances that you didn't understand before. Zeus is doing well. He's become something of a local celebrity, and Sarah uses his story to teach children about empathy and patience at her veterinary practice. He's also been certified as a therapy dog and visits nursing homes twice a week. We've been thinking about something, and we wanted to make you an offer. If you're interested, we'd like you to come by the house tomorrow evening. Not for confrontation or conflict, but because Zeus has been asking to see you. That probably sounds impossible, but animal behaviorists have documented cases where highly intelligent dogs maintain interest in specific humans, even former adversaries. Zeus sits by the fence sometimes in the spot where your encounter happened, and according to the experts, he may be processing unfinished emotional business. We think he wants closure, and maybe you do too. If you come, please bring Janet Miller, with you as a neutral supervisor. Zeus trusts her, and we trust her judgment about your progress. The choice is yours. David and Sarah Chen and Zeus. Margaret read the letter 3 more times, searching for hidden meanings or cruel intentions. But the tone was straightforward, almost clinical. The Chens weren't offering friendship or forgiveness. They were offering something more complex and potentially more valuable. Understanding. At 6 p.m., Margaret stood outside the bronze-plaqued gate with Janet Miller, her supervisor from the animal shelter. Janet was a weathered woman in her 70s who'd spent 50 years working with damaged animals and damaged people, often finding it difficult to distinguish between the two. "You sure about this?" Janet asked. "That dog nearly ended your life, as you knew it." "He saved my life," Margaret said quietly. "I just didn't understand it at the time." David Chen opened the gate himself, wearing the same calm expression Margaret remembered from their confrontation in the police parking lot. But there was something different in his eyes now. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of animosity. "Margaret," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Thank you for coming." Sarah was waiting in the backyard, along with a man Margaret didn't recognize, wearing a university polo shirt and carrying a notebook. "This is Dr. Andrew Kim from the Animal Behavior Program at State University," Sarah explained. "He's been studying Zeus's case as part of his research on intelligence and justice concepts in rescued animals." Dr. Kim stepped forward, his manner professional but excited. "Mrs. Whitmore, your case with Zeus has become quite famous in academic circles. We've documented unusual behavioral patterns suggesting that highly intelligent animals can develop sophisticated concepts of fairness and consequences. Zeus appears to have engineered not just your immediate downfall, but a systematic correction of what he perceived as environmental injustice." Margaret nodded numbly. "Even in academia, Zeus was being recognized as the architect of her destruction." "But that's not why we asked you here," Dr. Kim continued. "Zeus has been exhibiting what we call resolution-seeking behavior. He appears to be incomplete regarding his interaction with you." We'd like to observe a controlled re-encounter to see how both of you respond. At the far end of the yard, Zeus lay in his customary sunny spot, but Margaret could see his attention was focused entirely on her. The massive Rottweiler hadn't moved, but every line of his body suggested awareness and calculation. "Zeus," Sarah called softly. "Come." The dog rose gracefully and approached with measured steps. He was bigger than Margaret remembered, his coat glossier, his bearing more confident. This was an animal who'd found his place in the world and settled into his power. Zeus stopped exactly where he'd positioned himself 6 months ago during their first encounter, close enough to be impressive, far enough to be non-threatening. His yellow eyes met Margaret's, and she felt the same chill of recognition she'd experienced during their original confrontation. But something was different this time. Margaret knelt slowly, bringing herself to Zeus's eye level. "Hello, Zeus," she said quietly. "I think I owe you an apology." The dog's head tilted slightly, studying her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "I was wrong to come into your yard," Margaret continued, surprised by how easily the words came. "I was wrong to think I could intimidate you or your family, and I was wrong about what justice looks like." Zeus took a step closer, then another. Margaret remained perfectly still, letting him approach on his own terms. "You could have hurt me that day," she said. "You had every right to protect your territory, but you chose something better. You chose to let me destroy myself." Zeus was close enough now that Margaret could see the small scars around his muzzle, evidence of his difficult past. This was an animal who understood suffering and had chosen restraint over revenge. Slowly, carefully, Zeus extended his massive head and sniffed Margaret's outstretched hand. His tail moved slightly, not a wag exactly, but acknowledgement. "I've been working at the shelter where you came from," Margaret said. "Janet tells me you were there for 8 months before the Chens adopted you. 8 months of watching people pass you by because you were too big, too scary, too damaged." Zeus's ears pricked forward, and Margaret could see Dr. Kim scribbling notes in her peripheral vision. "I know what that feels like now," Margaret continued. "Being judged, being dismissed, being seen as the problem rather than the symptom. You taught me that." For a long moment, human and dog regarded each other across the gulf of species and experience. Then Zeus did something no one expected. He sat down and offered Margaret his paw. The gesture was so simple, so unexpectedly dignified, that Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. She took his massive paw in both her hands, feeling the weight and strength that he'd chosen not to use against her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching me what real justice looks like." Zeus held the connection for several heartbeats, then gently pulled his paw back and returned to his sunny spot. But before he lay down, he did something Dr. Kim would later describe as unprecedented in the literature. Zeus looked directly at the security camera, then back at Margaret, then gave a single deliberate wag of his tail. The message was unmistakable. Story complete. Justice served. Lesson learned. As Margaret walked back to the gate with Janet, she could feel the weight of 6 months of consequence lifting from her shoulders. Not the legal problems, those would take years to resolve. Not the financial devastation, that would probably follow her to the grave. But the crushing sense of being fundamentally wrong about everything that mattered was finally beginning to ease. "He forgave you," Janet said as they reached the car. "No," Margaret replied, looking back at the fence that had ended her old life and started her new one. "He educated me. There's a difference." As they drove away, Margaret could see Zeus in the rearview mirror, settling into his afternoon sunshine like a king surveying a kingdom he'd won through patience, intelligence, and an unshakable understanding that the best justice was the kind that taught rather than simply punished. 6 months ago, Margaret Whitmore had climbed a fence expecting to find violations. Instead, she'd found a teacher who'd shown her that real authority came not from the power to control others, but from the wisdom to control yourself. Zeus, the rescue dog who'd learned that survival required both strength and restraint, had engineered the perfect ending to their story. Not revenge, but redemption. Not destruction, but understanding. The revolution was complete, and everyone, even the former tyrant, had emerged transformed. In the end, Zeus had achieved something more valuable than victory. He'd created justice in its purest form, the kind that made everyone involved better than they were before. The security camera captured it all, adding one final chapter to a viral story that would be told for generations, not as a tale,